In Jungian psychology, self-destructive behavior is never interpreted as meaningless or random. It is understood as a deeply symbolic communication from the unconscious, often emerging when the conscious personality has become too narrow, rigid, or disconnected from inner truth. Jung believed that the psyche is always striving toward wholeness, and when parts of the self are denied, repressed, or pushed into the dark, the unconscious begins to speak in stronger and stronger ways. One of the primary channels for this communication is the shadow, the collection of traits, emotions, instincts, and potentials that the ego refuses to acknowledge. When the shadow is ignored for too long, it does not dissolve but becomes charged with psychic energy. Eventually, that energy forces its way toward consciousness in the form of symptoms, impulses, emotional eruptions, or destructive patterns. Self-destructive behavior can be understood as the shadow pounding on the door, insisting that something essential has been excluded and can no longer remain buried. It is not the shadow trying to harm the ego, but the unconscious trying to rebalance a psyche that has become one-sided. Jung also emphasized the role of the self, the archetype of wholeness, which guides the process of psychological development. The self is not the ego, but a larger organizing intelligence that seeks the integration of all psychic parts. When a person is living in contradiction to their deeper nature, following a life script imposed by family, culture, trauma, or fear, the self creates tension. If that tension goes unacknowledged, it can appear in the form of self-sabotaging patterns, breakdowns, or inner crises. From a Jungian perspective, these moments are not failures, but signals that the psyche is trying to reorganize itself. Self-destructive impulses may be the psyche's crude way of breaking the ego's rigid control so that transformation can begin. Jung often pointed out that what looks like destruction from the outside may be the beginning of an inner reconfiguration. Something old must collapse for something new to emerge. Another major component is the influence of complexes, autonomous emotional structures formed through early experiences, usually involving trauma, neglect, or intense relationships. Complexes operate independently of the conscious will. They can seize control of thoughts, emotions, and behavior. A trauma complex in particular can compel a person toward actions that seem irrational or self-punishing. But from a Jungian view, the complex is not consciously trying to inflict harm. It is repeating a psychic pattern that has become ingrained, because repetition provides familiarity and a strange form of psychological stability. Even if the pattern is unhealthy, it is known territory. Self-destructive behavior, therefore, may be the complex's attempt to maintain a stable internal world, to recreate the emotional atmosphere it understands. Jung described complexes as having their own personality, and when activated, they pull us into their story, often with overwhelming force. The psyche also follows a principle of compensation. If conscious life becomes too one-sided, for example, overly rational, emotionally suppressed, perfectionistic, or spiritually empty, the unconscious attempts to compensate by producing impulses that move in the opposite direction. This effort to restore balance can appear as destructive behavior when the imbalance is extreme. A person who has become numb may be driven toward sensations that are intense or risky. Someone who is overly controlled may experience sudden emotional storms or impulsive acts. Someone who has cut themselves off from instinct may be drawn into behaviors that reconnect them with raw, primal energies. The destructive aspect is not the real aim. It is a distorted attempt to re-establish equilibrium and to reconnect the person with their deeper emotional and instinctual life. Jung also believed that individuation, the process of becoming one's authentic, whole self, requires confronting and integrating the darker aspects of the psyche. If a person avoids this confrontation, the shadow gains power and may express itself through harmful impulses. When the ego is weak or overwhelmed, identification with the shadow can occur, leading to a spiral of self-sabotage or inner hostility. This is the negative path of individuation, where the energy meant for growth becomes trapped in destructive loops. But even here, the underlying purpose is the same. The psyche is demanding integration, insisting that the person turn inward, face the wounds, and reclaim the disowned parts of themselves. The destructive behavior is a kind of alarm system, indicating that the process of individuation has stalled or twisted off course. From a Jungian viewpoint, self-destructive behavior is always a sign that something within the psyche is out of alignment. It may point to unhealed trauma, ignored emotions, a repressed instinct, a broken inner relationship, or a life path that contradicts one's deeper values. But underneath all of it is the same message: the unconscious is trying to be heard. It is signaling that the current way of living is unsustainable, that something essential has been left behind, or that the person is out of harmony with their innermost self. The behavior itself is harmful, but the psychological intention behind it is not harm. It is communication, compensation, and the urgent push toward healing and wholeness. In this sense, Jungian psychology interprets self-destructive patterns not merely as pathology, but as a meaningful expression of a psyche striving to be whole, even when it must speak through pain to do so.